Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tearing into some incredibly potent ideas from excerpts of Nassim Nicholas Taleb's book, Skin in the Game.
Powerful stuff.
Our mission, to truly unpack the central concept, having skin in the game, and get to the core insights, the often surprising implications, and the practical relevance for you right now.
Yeah, because it's not just theory, is it?
Not at all. The material grounds this idea firmly in things that feel, well, existential to us as humans: justice, honor, sacrifice, and how they're fundamentally connected to bearing consequences.
And what's immediately clear from the sources is how this concept, skin in the game, or CTG as it's often abbreviated, acts as a powerful filter.
A filter.
It's presented as a rule that inherently reduces many of the disconnects that can emerge, especially as societies become more complex.
Okay, let's dig into that. It reduces disconnects.
Yeah.
What kind of mismatches are we talking about here?
Well, think about the gaps between what people say and what they do. CTG is presented as the force that, shrinks the gap between cheap talk and genuine action.
Right, talk is cheap.
Exactly. It aligns consequence with intention, connecting practice back to theory. It helps us distinguish, say, true honor from mere reputation and real expertise from charlatanism.
Separating the people who actually know and do from those who just talk a good game or, look the part.
Precisely. It also brings together the concrete and the abstract, the ethical and the purely legal, the genuine and the cosmetic. And importantly, it aligns collective interests with individual ones among many other divergences like science versus scientism.
So it's essentially a reality check, making sure there's alignment between claims and actual stakes.
That's a good way to put it.
What happens when that filter is removed? When there's no skin in the game?
That's where things get fragile, even dangerous. The sources use the ancient myth of Antaeus, the giant wrestler.
Oh yeah, I remember him.
His power came from his constant connection to Mother Earth. Touching the ground renewed his strength. He had skin in the game with reality, right? But his victims didn't have that same connection to consequence against him. He was powerful precisely because he wasn't exposed in the same way. He could dish it out, but
he wasn't bearing the same kind of risk. And the book draws a direct line from that lack of consequence for certain actors to, well, disastrous outcomes in the modern world.
Absolutely. Consider the failures of regime change interventions in places like Iraq and Libya. The material points out that decisions were made in, comfortable offices, far removed from the chaos that ensued on the ground.
Terrible consequences.
Including the emergence of slave markets. Those decision makers didn't bear the price of the catastrophic unintended consequences.
Wow.
It's likened to a doctor only focused on improving a patient's cholesterol number, even if the methods used end up causing the patient's death.
You optimize for an abstract metric?
While creating ruin in the real world.
Yeah.
The principle for any intervention, the book stresses, should always be first do no harm. Primum non nocere.
That disconnect between decision and consequence isn't limited to foreign policy either, is it? The sources highlight what they call the Bob Rubin trade.
Yes. This is a classic example from finance. The material points to figures like Robert Rubin profiting massively over $120 million from Citibank before the 2008 financial crisis.
Before the crash.
Right. When the system collapsed and required a taxpayer bailout, effectively transferring the bank's losses to the public, he didn't face a corresponding personal cost.
So he kept the profits.
His risk was asymmetrical. Heads he won, tails others paid. People like, Spanish grammar specialists, teachers, factory supervisors, ordinary taxpayers ended up footing the bill.
So the system allowed someone to collect massive upside while offloading the potential downside onto everyone else.
Precisely. And the sources are adamant. This isn't the functioning of a free market. This is enabled by government bailouts and interventions that remove skin in the game for those who should have it.
Which creating
a form of corruption where risk is transferred to the collective, often without their knowledge or consent.
This idea of symmetrical consequence and personal risk, it feels incredibly old. Does the book trace its roots?
Oh, it goes way back. It starts with Hammurabi's code, nearly 4,000 years ago in Babylon.
Hammurabi. Okay.
These 282 laws were publicly posted, and their central theme was establishing symmetry in transactions and interactions. The fundamental principle was that you couldn't harm another without facing a proportional consequence yourself.
That's about as direct a form of skin in the game as you can get a public declaration of reciprocal consequence. Build a house that collapses and kills the owner.
The builder gets put to death. Yeah. Very direct. The material then traces how this idea evolved. From Hammurabi, You see a refinement in Leviticus, which adds layers.
Okay.
Then the well-known golden rule. Treat others the way you would like them to treat you. But the sources argue the silver rule is actually more
The
robust.
silver rule. Do not treat others.
The way you would not like them to treat you. Yeah.
Why prefer the silver rule? Isn't the golden rule, better? More positive?
Well, the material suggests the silver rule is clearer and safer. It primarily tells you what not to do, avoid inflicting harm.
Which is easier to agree on.
Exactly. It's far easier to agree upon and understand universally than defining what is universally good for others and then imposing it. It's an example of via negativa.
Focusing on what to avoid.
Right. Focus on what to subtract or avoid, which the sources argue is a more reliable path to robustness than adding things based on abstract theories.
And the book warns strongly against abstract universal rules compared to local, practical ones.
Very strongly. It views universal behavior rules as potentially great on paper, disastrous in practice. Humans, the argument goes, are fundamentally local and practical, sensitive to scale and context.
We operate in our immediate surroundings.
Mostly, yes. Abstract universal prescriptions can become dangerous tools, attractive to those detached interventionistas we discussed.
The ones in the comfortable offices?
Right. Enabling them to impose their will without understanding the local consequences. The focus should be on simple, practical rules that apply directly to your immediate environment.
How does this play out in legal systems? Regulations versus common law?
Yeah, the sources contrast regulatory approaches with legal systems like the Anglo-Saxon common law, which evolved bottom-up through precedents and trial and error.
Learned from experience.
Exactly. Regulations are seen as additive, rigid, focused on the letter of the law, often choking enterprise and leading to what's called regulatory recapture.
Where the industry captures the regulator?
Or heavily influences them, yes. Where the regulated entities end up influencing or even writing the rules to benefit themselves.
So businesses capture the regulators or game the system created by the regulations.
Precisely. It becomes a system that benefits those who know how to navigate or manipulate the regulations, often at the expense of smaller players or the public.
Whereas common law?
Common law, on the other hand, focusing on the spirit and evolving adaptively, uses concepts like legal liability and efficient lawsuits to put the seller's or the actor's skin back in the game, forcing them to bear consequences for harm caused.
Which corporations probably don't like.
This is why, the material notes, corporations often dislike this bottom-up legal system. It holds them accountable in a way regulations sometimes don't.
And Sharia law is mentioned in this historical context, too.
Yes, specifically, the laws regulating transactions are viewed as a fascinating museum of the history of ideas on symmetry.
Symmetry again.
A core concept is the prohibition of gharar, which encompasses both uncertainty and deception in a transaction. The principle is that an inequality of uncertainty is effectively equivalent to theft. You're stealing stability or predictability from the other party if you have less consequence tied to the outcome than they do.
So this idea of balancing consequences, of symmetry and risk and reward, is a very ancient and persistent theme.
Absolutely. It seems fundamental.
How does skin in the game connect to fundamental concepts like survival and what we consider rational?
The sources draw a deep connection here, arguing that skin in the game is intrinsically linked to evolution itself. Learning, particularly across generations, happens because failure has consequences.
Right, extinction.
Extinction for entities that are too fragile or make fatal errors. Citing acts as a filter for robustness, not just a deterrent. Without the risk of extinction, there's no evolutionary pressure for adaptation and survival.
So the argument is, if you defend evolution, you should understand the necessity of consequence and risk. It's the same mechanism.
That's the point. Those who reject a creator's design but then want to impose complex human designs on systems, believing they can forecast and control everything without bearing consequences, are seen as, well, inconsistent.
They want the outcome without the process.
Kind of. The sources suggest that people who worship large institutions, the state or corporations, or who have excessive faith in forecasting models, often tend to dislike the messy reality that CGE imposes.
This is where the idea of the intelligence of time comes in, right? The Lindy effect.
Exactly. The Lindy effect, for things that aren't perishable, like ideas, technologies, or practices, suggests that their life expectancy increases with time.
The longer it's been around, the longer it's likely to stick around.
Pretty much. Time is the ultimate filter, keeping the robust and discarding the fragile. So a practice might seem strange or even irrational to an outsider today, but if it's survived and worked for a very long time,
It's probably doing something right.
the sources argue it's likely not irrational from a survival perspective. What works, and particularly what allows entities to persist or even prosper, cannot be considered stupid regardless of how it looks on paper.
Survival talks.
And BS walks, that's the phrase used.
And this filter of time perspective leads to a definition of rationality based on survival.
Yes, the book defines rationality not by the theories found in psychology textbooks, but by what allows a collective entity, whether it's a species, a culture, a company, or a family line, to survive over the long haul.
So it's about long-term persistence.
Right. What might look like overestimation of a rare, severe risk, a tail risk, is actually argued to be rational for survival. Some risks you simply cannot afford to take because they could lead to ruin, wipe out.
Total loss.
Others you can't afford not to take because inaction leads to guaranteed decline. This brings us to the concept of ergodicity.
Ergodicity. Okay, this can be a tricky concept. How does the book explain it simply?
Think about the difference between looking at a large group of people at one moment,
A snapshot.
right? That's like ensemble probability, versus following one person over a long stretch of time.
Like a movie of one person's life.
Exactly, that's time probability. The key insight is that these aren't always interchangeable, especially when there's a possibility of hitting an absorbing barrier.
An absorbing barrier like ruin or total failure. Bankruptcy, death.
Precisely. If you face a small probability of total ruin repeatedly over time, even if the probability is tiny each time, your chance of eventually hitting that ruin over a long enough period approaches 100%.
Russian roulette. One bullet, 6 chambers. Play often enough.
Your luck runs out.
Yeah?
Yeah. This ruin probability exists in the time domain for an individual or an entity with a finite life. It doesn't show up if you only look at a snapshot of many people at one time, where most will seem fine.
Because most people haven't hit ruin yet.
Exactly. The sources argue many psychological experiments and economic models misunderstand this, leading to flawed ideas about what's rational.
So behavior that seems risk-averse might just be someone intuitively avoiding that 100% probability of ruin over time. Smart survival instinct.
Exactly. The book sees much of what's labeled risk aversion as a practical, survival-driven avoidance of financial or physical suicide.
It's not irrational fear, it's rational avoidance of extinction.
That's the framing. Even actions behavioral economics might call mistakes, like mental accounting or playing with the house money, where a trader might increase risk after a win.
Thaler talks about that.
Right. The sources frame these not as errors, but as potentially sound, albeit perhaps unconscious, strategies to manage their risk over time relative to their starting point. Those who critique this behavior, the sources argue, often miss the ergodicity dimension. They're looking at the ensemble, not the time path.
And this connects to the idea of focusing our worries on the highest layer. What does that mean?
Yes. The precautionary principle, as described in the sources, is about protecting the system, the collective, the things meant to live a long time. Your death crossing the street, well, total ruin for you.
It's tragic, but...
It's ergodic for the system. It happens often enough in the ensemble, the system absorbs it. The truly worrying risks are systemic ones, where a failure for one is correlated with failure for many. Pandemics, financial collapse, climate change.
Things that could cause widespread ruin.
Exactly. We need to shift our focus from individual, non-systemic risks to those that threaten the collective or the highest layer.
This naturally brings us back to the agency problem, where interests are misaligned and how that manifests when people lack skin in the game in their professional lives.
The agency problem is fundamental, isn't it? You have an agent acting on behalf of a principal, but the agent's incentives aren't perfectly aligned with the principal's best interest.
It's everywhere.
It is. From addicts acting against their own long-term health, to bureaucrats pursuing narrow objectives regardless of systemic costs, to journalists prioritizing narrative over truth. Reality eventually purges those who consistently act without consequences, but professionals without SETIG can cause immense harm before that happens.
Let's look at specific professions the sources critique through this lens. Doctors, for instance.
Medicine, traditionally apprenticeship-based and grounded in experience, had more inherent SETIG, arguably.
You saw the results of your actions directly.
Right. But modern medicine faces the agency problem separating patient and provider. And attempts to impose accountability, like through legal liability or regulations, can paradoxically put skin in the wrong game.
How so?
For example, If a doctor is evaluated on 5-year patient survival rates, they might be incentivized to choose a treatment like radiation over surgery if it has better short-term stats, even if surgery leads to better outcomes after 20 years.
Ah, Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target,
It ceases to be a good measure, exactly. The metric itself, designed for accountability, can warp behavior. Pharmaceutical companies, similarly, are incentivized to focus on treatments for the mildly ill, a huge market of people who take drugs for years rather than the severely ill.
because the severely ill,
Sources put it starkly. Dead people, I'm told, stop taking drugs.
grim but makes the economic point. So the financial incentive pushes towards managing chronic conditions in large populations rather than curing severe ones.
That's the argument presented. The suggested solution from the material isn't more regulation, but patient behavior specifically, avoiding treatment for mild illnesses altogether,
Use your body's own healing.
and using medicine only for severe tail event conditions where the benefits clearly outweigh the risks and side effects.
Okay. What about journalists? The sources call this the mother of all agency problems. Strong words.
Yeah, for journalists, the agency problem is seen as particularly acute because their incentives are often aligned with pleasing editors, publishers, or perhaps most importantly, other journalists.
Their peer group.
Not necessarily with delivering unvarnished truth, especially if it's unpopular. The sources argue this profession isn't Lindy compatible with older forms of information dissemination, like word of mouth or the organic two-way spread of news in ancient marketplaces, or through figures like barbers.
Barbers as news sources.
Right. Modern journalists tied to careers and reputation within their peer group are vulnerable to manipulation by lobbyists or groupthink. Saying something genuinely against the prevailing narrative can effectively end their career.
High reputational risk.
Unlike in business, where genuine innovation or contrarian bets, if right, are rewarded.
Okay. What about academics, intellectuals, bureaucrats, the IYI category?
They're often described as lacking intellectual valor or being stochastophobes, fearful of randomness and uncertainty.
Stochastophobes. Fear of the random.
Yeah. The university setting can become a refuge of the voyeur, where people analyze the world from a distance without consequences. They may struggle to distinguish real science from scientism.
The ritual of science without the substance.
Right. The appearance or ritual of science without the empirical robustness. They can pathologize people or ideas they don't understand, fitting the description of the IYI, the intellectual yet idiot.
High IQ, low common sense.
Something like that. Someone who is highly educated but lacks practical understanding and is easily fooled by the abstract. Their focus is often on reputation, what his words are doing to his reputation, rather than the impact of their ideas on reality.
And the deadlift comment.
Like there's a satirical jab included. He doesn't even deadlift, implying a lack of engagement with simple, fundamental physical reality. Grounding.
Contrasted with practitioners who are out in the real world, presumably deadlifting.
Maybe. Practitioners, the sources argue, naturally gravitate towards simple, robust heuristics because they face direct consequences if things go wrong. They aren't rewarded for complexity's sake.
Results matter more than fancy methods.
Exactly. People bred in systems without sightsee, like many institutions, are rewarded for the perception of intelligence or complexity, and they pay no price for the side effects of their complicated solutions.
Like the GMO example again.
There's even a meta-problem.
Yeah.
The solution to the agency problem can itself have an agency problem. The GMO example is used again, a complicated transgenic approach to adding vitamins to rice, with unknown complex system effects and statistical flaws, versus the simpler, cheaper approach of just providing vitamins separately.
The simple solution gets overlooked.
The complicated solution has no incentive to be simple or consider side effects, because the rewards are based on the research process, the publications, the grants, not the simple, safe outcome.
There's a strong critique throughout the book about modern life being too focused on appearing competent rather than actually being competent, tied to this lack of CITG.
Looking the part.
Yes, the idea is that when results are directly linked to reality, when you have skin in the game, your image matters much less. The market or reality itself judges you.
Substance over style.
But in systems with significant agency problems, where job evaluation or funding depends on appearances, image becomes paramount. CEOs are described as often looking and sounding interchangeable, like actors playing a role,
The corporate uniform, the jargon.
rather than diverse individuals forged by direct experience. The book advises avoiding books where the author photo looks too perfectly the part. Skilled operators, whether entrepreneurs or even criminals, often don't look like the stereotype.
The green lumber fallacy. When you're divorced from direct consequences, You can master the jargon and the cosmetics without grasping the essential reality. This is the green lumber fallacy, focusing on non-essential details, like the color of green lumber, while missing the essential ones, like its price fluctuations and market dynamics.
And academic institutions can fall into this cosmetic trap. Sounds like a harsh critique.
The sources are quite critical, yes. Never hire an academic unless his function is to partake of the rituals of writing papers or taking exams, is a quote used.
Ouch.
The argument is that academic complications and rituals can serve to separate academics from the messy reality, fostering a focus on cosmetic performance over real-world impact, like a bishop's elaborate dress compared to his actual function.
Ritual over substance again?
In some fields, competition itself can destroy knowledge because of the agency problem and lack of transparency. Courses can become fashion trends, like a hypothetical, post-colonial study-oriented critique of quantum mechanics, driven by reputation or trends, rather than fundamental knowledge or real-world application.
This contrasts with the practical, time-tested wisdom found in, say, a real gym, not the fancy fitness center.
Right. The sources suggest real gyms aren't filled with expensive, complicated machines. Those machines isolate muscles, offer complicated settings, and don't transfer skills to movements outside the machine.
They only make you good at using that machine.
Pretty much. A simple barbell, on the other hand, works the whole body, is the simplest, cheapest, and most Lindy-compatible tool available. Weightlifters have known its effectiveness for millennia. It's practical, robust, validated by time, not theoretical complexity.
Simple, effective, skin in the game with gravity. Okay, shifting gears slightly. Let's look at where else skin in the game shows up, beyond just professions. What about artisans?
Artisans are described as having soul in the game.
Soul in the game. I like that.
Their motivation isn't solely financial, it's existential first. They combine art and business, driven by pride in quality and adherence to sacred taboos they wouldn't violate for profit.
Doing things right for its own sake.
Exactly. The shoemaker example is used. Exporting jobs for abstract economic efficiency might increase GDP, but it cheats people of their identity and soul, denying them the chance to pursue things for their own sake, what Aristotle called heret.
Excellence, virtue, and action.
Striving for excellence or virtue in action, doing something well because it's inherently good to do.
And risk takers. They seem to embody skin in the game almost by definition.
They are the epitome, constantly exposed to consequence. They're often socially unpredictable. The sources joke that not wearing a tie might be one part arrogance, one part aesthetics, one part convenience, but it signals a certain freedom associated with bearing personal risk.
Not conforming.
They are the wild animals, needing to survive in the real world. They walk the walk, like sparrows whose chirps actually signal their fighting ability, unlike some birds with complex deceptive calls.
Honest signaling because there's a cost.
Right. The material contrast, the dog, employee, and the wolf, contractor entrepreneur. The dog's life appears secure, but it cannot survive without its owner. The wolf is trained to survive independently.
The illusion of security versus real resilience.
Employees abandoned by employers, the sources argue, struggle to bounce back precisely because they lack that independent survival FITG. The IBM example is mentioned.
What happens when people acquire wealth? Does that change their relationship with SITG?
The sources argue that getting rich can actually lead people to shed their SITG-driven experiences and intuitive preferences. They lose touch with what genuinely makes them happy or what works.
They get insulated from reality.
In a way, they substitute constructed preferences, things sellers want to convince them they need. This often leads to increased complication and misery or negative utility.
More isn't always better.
The Michelin restaurant example versus a simple good pizza. Often, sophistication beyond a certain point leads to degradation of the actual experience. The book posits an inverted U-curve for wealth or GDP. Beyond a certain point, it brings harm.
Diminishing returns, then negative returns.
Someone will always try to sell you something, even past the point where it's good for you, leading to degradation.
That Seneca quote applies here. Poison is drunk in golden cups.
It captures the idea perfectly. Wealth makes you a target, particularly for scams based on complication and unnecessary sophistication, a fate often spared the poor who have to rely on simpler, time-tested things.
How does family fit into this picture of skin in the game? It seems like the ultimate STG.
Family introduces a profound, unavoidable vulnerability. There's often a deep conflict between obligations to an abstract collective like society or humanity and the very concrete obligation to your own progeny, ensuring their future, paying for college, feeding them.
Your kids versus the world.
Society, the sources observe, sometimes prefers celibate heroes who can devote themselves entirely to an abstract humanity without the messy, conflicting psyche of family. Martyrs like Socrates who had young children highlight this conflict.
That vulnerability can be exploited.
Absolutely. Throughout history, samurai leaving family as hostages, Romans and Huns exchanging children, even celibacy or financial independence isn't absolute immunity. There are hidden vulnerabilities, like targeting family or associates.
And institutions face this too.
Institutions like universities, too, are seen as vulnerable to detractors, using labels like racist or sexist. They fear the label and reputational damage more than engaging with the substance, showing a lack of psyche in intellectual debate.
Fear of the mob.
To be truly free of this conflict, as Cleon is quoted, you need no friends or family. The boundary between individual and collective psyche is often fuzzy.
The sources also discuss terrorism and communal punishment, a highly sensitive topic, through the lens of injecting psyche.
Yes, this section, as presented in the sources, looks at a grim scenario where a perpetrator, like a suicide bomber, has a massive asymmetric payoff, particularly the upside from death.
They have nothing left to lose, in a sense.
Or believe they gain everything through martyrdom. Traditional scriptures offer conflicting views on holding children accountable for parents' sins. In cases of terrorism, where traditional justice methods fail against those seeking martyrdom, the sources controversially propose making the perpetrators' families bear an indirect, predefined cost.
A financial burden.
Like a financial burden. This is presented not as retribution against innocence, but as a calibrated deterrent mechanism to inject skin in the game where it's otherwise absent for the individual perpetrator.
Making the consequences felt by the wider group.
While carefully avoiding creating a martyrdom narrative for the families themselves. It's a difficult, controversial idea, exploring how to create consequence in an extreme scenario where individual psyche seems broken.
Okay, let's shift to another core concept the sources explore. Minority rule. This sounds counterintuitive.
It is, but it's a fascinating phenomenon, particularly visible in complex systems, where a small, persistent, intransigent minority can effectively impose its preferences on a much larger majority.
How does that work?
The collection doesn't behave like a simple average or sum of its parts. Think about peanut allergies.
Right, tiny percentage, huge impact.
A tiny minority of the population has a severe, life-threatening allergy. To accommodate them, peanuts are banned from airplanes, schools, public spaces. The vast majority, who are not allergic, have their preferences dictated by the minority's needs because the allergic person cannot yield, while the non-allergic can.
The asymmetry of tolerance.
Exactly. Think about honesty versus criminality. The honest majority won't commit crimes, but the criminal minority might. Religious dietary laws, like halal or kashrut, a minority demanding these products can lead to their widespread availability in stores, especially if the price difference for the majority is small or negligible.
Because the majority will eat halal kosher, but the minority won't eat non-halal kosher.
Precisely. Organic food is another. Those who refuse to eat transgenic GMOs can drive the market, because people who will eat GMOs will also eat non-GMO, but not vice versa.
So the majority's flexibility means the minority's rigidity can win the day.
Exactly. The sources cite the example of Big Ag and GMOs, thinking they just needed to convince a majority. But they missed this principle of asymmetric choice they needed to convince almost everyone to be safe, because a small percentage refusing GMOs could steer group choices.
Automatic cars, too.
Automatic transmission cars are another example. Manual drivers can drive automatic, but not the reverse, contributing to the prevalence of automatics.
This sounds like it has massive implications for social dynamics and even politics.
Absolutely. The sources reference models by physicist Serge Gellem, showing how a small minority can steer choices or prevail in elections in complex social systems due to these asymmetric dynamics. It highlights the power of a dedicated, stubborn minority.
The veto effect.
Right. The veto effect is linked here. McDonald's, the book suggests, doesn't thrive because it's everyone's favorite, but because it's not vetoed by a small percentage of any key demographic group. It's a safe, uncontroversial choice when options are limited or uncertain.
The lowest common denominator choice, almost.
It's like a refuge from risky meals for Italians traveling abroad, the book jokes.
Religious spread is also explained using minority rule dynamics.
Yes. Interfaith marriages, for instance, tend to shrink minority populations if the rules favor the majority's faith, like Islam, often requiring one Muslim parent. Judaism has historically maintained its minority status through the rule that only a child with a Jewish mother is Jewish.
Matrilineal descent.
Right. Gnostic faiths requiring both parents to be adherents, like the Druze or Yazidis, tend to shrink because even one mixed marriage removes the children from the group. Terrain matters too. Flat regions like Egypt lead to mixing, while mountainous areas like Lebanon or Galilee allow populations to concentrate and reduce exposure to outside influences.
And the drift of Mediterranean religions towards intolerance. How does minority rule explain that?
This is described as being taken over by the most puritanical and intolerant branches, like Wahhabism or Salafism, which impose rules that accommodate the most intolerant interpretation.
Because the intolerant won't compromise.
Exactly. This maximally intolerant rule then gets imitated by groups like ISIS, because the tolerant minority will interact with the intolerant, but the intolerant refuse to interact with the intolerant effectively impose their rule via this minority effect. The most inflexible sets the standard for the whole group over time.
Wow. That leads to a powerful warning about the dangers of intolerance in a democracy.
Yes, the sources argue that an intolerant minority can control and ultimately destroy a democracy if the tolerant majority isn't careful. They violate the silver rule by imposing harm on others.
By refusing coexistence.
Right. The book describes the West as committing suicide by treating intolerant strains of Salafism, which explicitly deny the validity of other religions and even advocate harm, with the same principles of tolerance extended to groups that do adhere to the silver rule. A tough argument.
But small groups aren't always destructive, surely.
Far from it. The sources balance this by citing Margaret Mead's famous quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has."
So it cuts both ways.
Revolutions and significant societal growth often originate from obsessive minorities. The asymmetric rule of a stubborn, focused group can be a necessary force for positive change somewhere in the system. You need someone to be intransigent for the right thing sometimes.
Let's shift gears once more to religion, belief, and sacrifice, which the book examines through the lens of skin in the game with the divine, so to speak.
It's a really interesting angle. The sources highlight the confusion around the word religion, noting different meanings across cultures and time.
It's not one thing.
No. For early Jews and Muslims, it was primarily law, din. Romans saw it more as social rituals and civic duty. Early Christianity had an uneasy relationship with formal law. In modern context, a Christian minority in the Levant might signify a commitment to secularism and separation of church and state.
And Gnostics.
Gnostics, by contrast, were mystery religions with core beliefs often hidden from most members, a survival strategy against persecution. Different context, different meanings.
Salafism and Soviet communism are compared. That seems provocative.
Yes, both are described as having a similarly all-embracing scope, seeking to control human activity and thought across the board. Totalizing systems.
And different types of belief add to the confusion.
Absolutely. Belief isn't monolithic. It can be epistemic, believing something is factually true, procedural metaphorical, acting as if something is true or understanding it symbolically, or literal. This distinction is crucial.
Actions versus words again.
Kind of. Salafi Islamists are presented as holding literal beliefs, while Christian beliefs are often understood metaphorically today. Causes confusion when people talk past each other.
Pascal's wager, the idea of believing just in case, critiqued from a CTG standpoint.
Yeah, the sources argue belief can't be a free option. True belief requires symmetry, a cost skin in the game. Pascal's wager, lacking that cost or commitment, is seen as sterile, a form of religion without the necessary sacrifice or consequence. Too easy.
The gods, it seems, don't like cheap signaling. They want proof.
That's the argument presented. Ancient worship in the Mediterranean and Semitic world involved sacrifice, marva, korban, meaning getting closer via sacrifice. Burnt offerings were often not for human consumption, meant purely for the divine.
A real cost.
A tangible cost. The sources see figures like Imam Hussein offering himself as korban, or practices like Ashura self-flagellation or Christian flagellation, as literal manifestations of skin in the game with the divine, a costly signal of devotion.
This practice of literal sacrifice eventually became more metaphorical in many traditions.
Yes, the book points to verses like Romans 12.1, present your bodies as a living sacrifice. Judaism, after the destruction of the Second Temple, ended animal sacrifice. The story of Abraham and Isaac, while stopping human sacrifice,
A crucial turning point.
reinforced the divine demand for intent and willingness to sacrifice, insisting on Site G even in its symbolic form. The commitment had to be real, even if the act changed.
So religiousness is defined more by deeds than words, by the cost borne.
Precisely. The sources distinguish between those atheists in actions, religious in words, often fitting most Orthodox or Catholic Christians today, perhaps, and those religious in actions, religious in words, exemplified by Salafi Islamists or suicide bombers, whose actions bear tangible, high costs.
So actions reveal the true belief.
Actions bear cost and are detectable. Beliefs or superstitions without cost or consequence are seen as not necessarily irrational from a survival standpoint, but also less significant than actions which do expose one to reality.
Julian the Apostate's attempt to revive paganism failed because he missed this core structure. He tried to make it too organized.
Yes, Julian tried to create a centralized pagan system with bishops and synods, mimicking the church he grew up in. But paganism was inherently distributed, with diverse practices tied to specific places and communities.
It wasn't a single thing.
No, he failed because he tried to impose a centralized hierarchical structure onto something that fundamentally lacked that monolithic category and structure, a bit like trying to impose rigid regulations on a complex, adaptive common law system. It didn't fit.
And kashrut laws, their survival is attributed to group cohesion, not necessarily health.
The sources suggest that whatever their initial purpose, laws like kashrut helped populations survive not through any inherent rationality in the diet itself, but because following them fostered cohesion, trust, and a vibrant, interconnected network among those who adhered to them.
Eating together builds community.
Eating together under shared rules helped the group stick together through difficult times, contributing to their long-term survival via group selection, perhaps.
Let's wrap up by looking at virtue and action through the lens of skin in the game. How does it apply there?
Virtue, the book argues, is not a commodity or an ornament you simply acquire or display. It's not merchandising. True virtue requires skin in the game.
Risk.
Taking risks, making sacrifices, particularly reputational risk.
And virtue signaling. Predictably, not a fan.
The sources are clear. Do not engage in it. Virtue signaling is seen as empty display. Mob shaming, often accompanying it, is described as a vice, a combination of bullying and cowardice, not virtue.
So what is virtuous?
True virtue lies in actions that cost you something, like sticking up for an unpopular truth when it risks your reputation. That shows real conviction.
What advice is given to young people who want to save the world? Sounds like a recipe for virtue signaling.
Could be. The top 3 pieces of advice given in the sources are: 1. Never engage in virtue signaling.
Okay, check.
Never engage in rent-seeking.
And rent-seeking is? Remind us.
Basically trying to make money or gain advantage by manipulating the rules of the game or extracting value without actually creating new value or producing good services, lobbying for subsidies, creating unnecessary licenses.
Exploiting the system. Got it. Avoid that. And number 3.
3. You must start a business. Put yourself on the line. Take bounded risks where you understand the potential downsides.
Start a business.
Yeah.
Why is that seen as inherently virtuous or helpful?
Doing business, genuine economic activity with direct consequences, is seen as always helpful because it creates value and brings activity without requiring large, systemic, risky changes imposed from the top down. You're interacting directly with reality, with customers.
Compared to?
Institutions like the aid industry, by contrast, are seen as equally likely to cause harm as help, precisely because of the layers of agency and lack of direct CITG for those involved. Good intentions aren't enough.
The contrast between geopolitical analysis and reality on the ground also comes up here, right?
Yes. Pundits without skin in the game look at abstract geopolitics, seeing conflicts between entities as if they were planets, Mars versus Saturn. People actually living in the affected areas, bearing the consequences of conflict, tend to want peace, business, normal life.
Their CITG is very direct.
Extremely. War journalists, too, can get a distorted view if their information comes primarily from other journalists or officials, lacking direct, costly exposure to the reality of war for civilians. Real people with skin in the game are often interested in commonalities and peaceful coexistence, not abstract conflicts.
And even history itself has biases due to this lack of skin in the game and how it's recorded.
Yes, there is a bias towards recording the lurid and the dramatic events, the lions eating the impalas, rather than the long periods of peace and stability.
Bad news travels fast.
And gets written down. This leads to confusing the intensity of an event with its frequency, like focusing on few intense wars in Italy over centuries, while missing the massive, concentrated death in one war during a supposedly stable period. There's an overestimation bias in accounts of conflict and failure.
And we miss the silent evidence.
Crucially, the silent facts, the absence of data about things not happening, the long periods of peace, the businesses that didn't fail, are missed because they don't create records for people without CG to analyze.
Bringing it back to personal virtue, the Spartan mother telling her son to come back with it or on it, with his shield, victorious or on it, dead, that's extreme SITG.
That's the ultimate expression of direct, personal risk-taking for the collective. It's contrasted starkly with modern accommodations, like people feeling forced to work for what the sources call disgusting lobbies just to pay for their children's college.
The ethical compromise.
The critique is that people often fit their ethics to their profession, rather than finding a profession that aligns with their ethics, a direct consequence of lacking CG in their career choices, or maybe feeling trapped.
And the idea of soul in the game, that seems to tie it all together.
Putting your soul into something, whether it's a craft, a business, or a cause, is presented as a natural filter. It forces you to align your actions with your deepest values and bear personal emotional cost, which acts as a powerful guide and validator. You care deeply about the outcome because you are in it.
We've covered an immense amount of territory today, exploring this really powerful concept of skin in the game. Let's quickly recap some of the key ideas from the sources, just to crystallize them.
Okay. We started with skin in the game itself, the fundamental principle of bearing consequence, and how it acts as a filter, reducing numerous divergences between appearance and reality, talk, and action.
Right. Then the Lindy effect, understanding how time is the ultimate filter for survival and robustness. What lasts, lasts for a reason.
We delved into ergodicity, recognizing the critical difference between time probability, one person over time facing ruin, and ensemble probability, a snapshot of many people. Crucial for understanding risk and survival.
We explored the minority rule, how a small, intransigent group can impose its preferences on a larger majority due to asymmetric choices. The stubborn tail wags the dog.
We touched on the green lumber fallacy, mistaking cosmetic or non-essential knowledge for the truly essential stuff needed to operate in the real world.
And we highlighted concepts like via negativa, focusing on what to avoid as a path to robustness. Virtue merchandising, the empty display of virtue without cost.
The agency problem, where misaligned interests lead to harm when agents lack CG, and specific examples like the Bob Rubin trade and the IYI, intellectual yet idiot, illustrating the dangers when consequences detach from action and expertise.
The central argument woven through all these concepts, drawn from the sources, seems to be that skin in the game is an indispensable filter for justice, for honor, for survival, for distinguishing genuine action from cheap talk, and for building robust systems.
And its absence is presented as a root cause of ethical failures, fragility, and systemic risks across virtually every domain.
It truly offers a potent framework for cutting through noise and complexity in the world, doesn't it? By prompting that fundamental question, who has something real, something potentially costly at stake here? Who's exposed?
It absolutely shifts your perspective. Once you start looking for where skin in the game is present or absent, you see the world differently in political decisions, in expert advice, in how institutions operate, even in your personal interactions and who you trust.
Yeah, it's a powerful lens.
So, given how widespread the lack of skin in the game seems to be in modern life, according to these sources, and how difficult it is to effectively impose from the outside,
What are the most robust ways for you, our listener, to live and act with skin in the game in your own life? And armed with this perspective, how can you better identify those who truly have it and those who are operating without consequence, just talking the talk?
something to keep in mind as you navigate the complexities of the world around you. A challenging question, really.